quite a day. I think we'll all agree, those of us who've been here since the beginning or came in after the first one. What struck me, particularly as we've gone through the day, is that every so often my ears have slightly perked up because there's been mention of a building that I am going to be mentioning in my talk now. So those of you who have been here most of the day, you will now be rewarded with little glimpses of some of the buildings that have been mentioned. Now, I'm talking about Tudor architecture in Essex, and I don't know what your idea of Tudor architecture is, but it might well be this, which is Hampton Court, or it might perhaps be this, which is St. James's Palace, or it might very possibly be this, which is, of course, Lord Marney. And if you think about what they all have in common, well, they're pretty impressive buildings. They happen to all have been gatehouses or have featured gatehouses. They have a slightly sort of castle-like atmosphere to them, but yet they're very obviously not castles, they're not defensible buildings. But above all, what I'd say about them as to what they have in common is that they are all built of brick, basically. And this new fashion for brick during the Tudor age was very fortunate for Essex, which had a long tradition of using the material for the very simple practical reason that there is no good local building stone in Essex. So I think it's worth taking a few minutes at the start of this talk to look back at the use of brick in Essex, which will show us, apart from anything else, that what we like to think of as Tudor architecture doesn't start neatly with the change of Royal House in 1485. So we'll look first at some churches before moving on to domestic architecture. And in terms of use of brick in Essex, you really have to go back very early, right back to Norman buildings, such as this one, St. Botolph's Priory in Colchester. And you'll see a lot of brickwork there, a lot of bricks used in the construction there, in amongst a lot of other rubble and lesser stone. And this is a building which was dedicated in 1177, and all those bricks there that you see there are actually reused Roman bricks. Now, there was a big Roman presence in Essex, as you will know. The Romans built a lot in brick, which are not really what we think of as bricks. They're more like rather sort of thick tiles. And there was an awful lot of Roman brick lying around in Essex, and if you wanted to build a building, you would just reuse whatever material there was available. And St. Botolph's Priory there, you can see it in all its splendour. That, of course, would all have been covered over, perhaps some of it faced in ashlar stone, other parts of it rendered, but all that has fallen off or been used in other ways. Now, in due course, the clever old monks at Coggeshall, they, as it were, rediscovered how to make brick. So some of the earliest, as it were, homemade bricks that we have in the county are at Coggeshall Abbey. Here's one of the Coggeshall Abbey buildings with brick used and the corners and around the windows at those sort of crucial structural junctures where rubble stone wouldn't really stand up very well by itself. So it's a sort of reinforcement at the corners. So that's a little bit of Coggeshall Abbey, and not very far from Coggeshall, on the way towards Braintree, there's this little church at Bradwell, also 12th century, where you can see brick again, this new type of Coggeshall type brick used on the corners, on the coins, and also round that little window there. And the use of medieval brick goes on being developing through the centuries. This is the church at Thorrington with a 14th century porch. Again, you've got some rather prominent brick there. And the tower there is actually 15th century, built with bequests of John and Marjorie Death, who died in 1477 and 1483, respectively. And the point of showing you that is that although it's a conventional stone and flint tower, that is all facing, and the sort of carcass, the body of that tower, is actually built of brick, as is the tower of the church at Dedham, which built in the first 2 decades of the 16th century. What is less usual is a building totally built of brick at this era, but there's one very prominent example, East Horndon Church, built in the period sort of 1442, 1476. I mean, what you see there is not all of one build. There have been different bits added on at different times, but that basically is a church that was built of brick from the outset. But as I say, that's a pretty unusual example. Moving over to the domestic side, the first prominent domestic brick building in the county would be the Moot Hall in Malden. It became the town hall, had a variety of uses, became the town hall and the courtroom and so on. But it was originally built as a residence with a sort of tower at the back that you can't see from the street. But if you go inside and find the tower inside, you'll see the image on the left there. It has this rather marvelous brick spiral staircase, and even with, you see there, it has this integral brick handrail built into the wall of the staircase. This building, the Moot Hall, was always thought to date from about the 1420s. It's now thought to be perhaps a bit earlier, 1390s. So really very early for a brick building. And the staircase on the right it's not actually another view of the same staircase, although it looks very similar. And you can see it also has this same integral handrail. That's actually Fawburn Hall, just outside Whittam, which was built after 1439. The license to crenellate was granted in 1439. And here it is, where particularly with that great tower on the corner, still looking really very castle-like as a building, altered over subsequent centuries, so we don't quite get an idea now of the whole thing. But I think you can already see by this date, by 1439, let's say up to 1450, you are really beginning to see a domestic building that is becoming very much more Tudor in character. And just a tiny little bit later is Nether Hall at Roydon, over towards sort of Bishop Stortford up that way, built in the 1460s, unfortunately already a ruin by the mid-18th century. But there is something that is looking really not very far off the gatehouse of Lord Marney, say, a very tall structure with sort of flanking staircases there, either side of the entrance gateway. You can also see on that, you can also see the diaper patterning, that crisscross patterning of darker bricks in the red brickwork there, and that's something that we'll be coming on to later. So Nether Hall built in the 1460s, and then we come to this frankly rather arbitrary date of 1485 that brings us into the Tudor period. And there is, for whatever reason, from this point onwards, there are many examples of brick towers and porches being added to medieval churches. It is perhaps the most typical thing in terms of church building at this early Tudor time. This is Gestingthorpe, where the church tower, just showing you some examples where we know precisely, we have a very good idea when these things were built. This is the church tower at Gestingthorpe, built with a bequest of money in 1498. So it's likely to have been built very soon after that date. And incidentally, although we're not really talking about interiors to any great extent, worth showing you this wonderful double hammer beam roof in Gestingthorpe. And part of the reason for showing you this is that it's a rare example of a roof where we have a good idea who actually designed it. Thomas Loveday, who was one of the donors, and there are records that he was resident in Gestingthorpe in 1523 to 4. So that gives us a very good indication of when it was built. Down in the south of the county, just outside Southend, this is Rochford, the west tower of Rochford Church. And again, this can be dated with some precision, because over the doorway there, you can just see the arms of Thomas Butler, Earl of Ormond, who died in 1519. So probably built, or at least started, by him during his lifetime. And by coincidence, the same date, another church, Tilbury Juxta Clare, there's an inscription on the outside of the church there, which is not an original inscription, but there's no particular reason to doubt that it's an authentic copy, which says that this tower was built in 1519 by Elizabeth de Vere, Countess of Oxford. So these are bits that have been added on to existing medieval churches, or rebuilding probably of an existing tower. There is a rare example, another rare example of a complete brick church. This is at Chignall's Smealy. Unfortunately, we don't have a reliable date for this, but it just passes for early 16th century. Interesting about this, I think, is that it's quite hard to tell, I would suggest, looking at it, what date it is. I mean, it could equally be Victorian, and there's nothing very innovative about the design of it. It's a very typical layout with west tower, nave, and chancel. It is a medieval church that might have been built somewhere else, would be built in stone, but here happens to be built in brick because we're in Essex. One particular feature of this church is that its brickness even extends to the font. But the brick font that you see here is not what people would have seen at the time. It was actually plastered. The plaster was taken off in 1904 to reveal the brick, and that's a bit of a theme that we'll be developing. We'll be developing as we go on, starting with this at St. Osyth. St. Osyth was mentioned in the first talk this morning because the Abbot Vintner of St. Osyth, he was one of the participants in the funeral of Henry Marney here in 1523. And it's interesting to think that at the same time that he was here and admiring the new building, no doubt, Abbot Vintner also had ambitions to rebuild down at St. Osyth. There was the priory at St. Osyth, which we'll come to in a moment, but this is the parish church at St. Osyth, and in the 1520s, Abbot Vintner started to rebuild the parish church, and the brick parts there, that is as far as he got. So he didn't manage to rebuild the chancel. He didn't manage to rebuild the tower, which is, as it were, behind us, looking down towards the chancel there. And you can see how the chancel has ended up being off-centre. The chancel arch there is no longer in the centre of the nave because he was rebuilding the nave on a bigger scale. And those red brick piers and arches, we look at those and we probably think, wow, that is marvellous. This is lovely old Tudor red brick. But for them, that is not what they want. That was not the look that they were aiming for. And until 1899, when that church was restored, all that brickwork was plastered so that it looked like stone. That is what they wanted to achieve. And you can see something very similar in the church at Ingatstone, where the South Chapel was added in 1556, and again it has brick piers, brick columns, which were originally plastered. And if you go there, you can still see remains of that plasterwork. Interesting, really, what Abbot Vintner was up to in the 1520s. This is the priory itself. On the left of the screen there is the 18th century edition, but on the right there in the corner, those are his lodgings. And if we go inside behind that big window, but you can also see, but on the right there you can see the inside of the window, which is very elaborately carved, and that goes right up over the arch, and includes various emblems and that indicate that Abbot Vintner built it, and also includes the date 1527, which is always very helpful to have a precise date for these things. And 12 years later, that was it. It was all gone. It was all dissolved. So right up to the end of the priory's existence, the abbot was building with no thought for the future, or no awareness of what was coming down the road. This is a particularly ornate example of a brick porch. Again, we can just say 16th century. This is at Pevmarsh. And the point of showing you this is partly that it is a very elaborate example with those stepped gables there. But also on this porch, there are traces of what is called ruddling. Now, ruddle is a mixture of red ochre and size, so it's like a sort of primitive paint. And there is a lot of evidence for brickwork that has been ruddled, i.e. painted red. And you might think, well, goodness me, you've got red bricks, what's the point of painting them red? Well, the fact is that bricks come out in different shades of red, and some bricks are better than others. And we like mellow old brickwork, don't we? That's one of the things we rather look for in old buildings. But if you were a Tudor and you're putting up a new building, you didn't want your building to look old and mellow. You wanted it to look brand spanking new and smart. So to disguise the variable colorings of the bricks, they would often cover them with this sort of wash to make them a uniform color. And in some places you can find that a thin layer of mortar has been smeared over the bricks to even out to any discrepancies, and then fine lines drawn to simulate the pointing, and then the whole thing would be coloured and white lines painted along the incised marks. So it's a very different impression to the one that we are used to. And that brings us neatly to Lord Marney Church, mostly rebuilt by Henry Marney, i.e. before 1523. And if we start with the tower there, you can see the red brick with the diaper pattern that I mentioned earlier, these patterns of different coloured headers. The colours can vary. I was looking here at lunchtime when you could actually get up quite close to some of those darker bricks in the sunlight, and they're all slightly different colours. They're usually a sort of blue-grey, but they can also be greenish. And the thing about the coloured bricks, the darker bricks that form this pattern, they have a sort of glaze on them, and you can see that when the sun is shining. So if you can imagine that tower, if you've gone to the trouble of doing your diaper work, you don't want to cover that up completely. You still want to see that, but you might want to heighten the impression of it. So if you wash that with a red, that colour will stick to the normal brick, but it won't stick to the glazed bricks. It'll wash off that. So the difference between the normal red brick and the dark headers will be greatly accentuated. Those darker bricks will stand out and shine even more than they do already. Now, also on this slide, you can see that the wall of the nave there has been plastered at some time. You can see the remains of it there. It's not thought that it was originally rendered. It's not thought the whole thing was originally rendered. but the render round the windows that actually forms the frames, if you like, and the mouldings of the windows, that render is original, and that was to make the windows look as if they were made not out of brick, as they were, but out of stone. And that's fairly common. We'll see another example of that in a moment. But what is particularly unusual here is that the hood moulds, that's the mouldings round the tops of the windows, so up around there, that has not just been rendered, but it's then been painted a sort of pinky colour, and the sort of traces of that. And the point of that is to make the mouldings look as if they're made out of terracotta, that new fashionable material, rather expensive, that was used for Henry Marney's tomb and on the tower itself. So the church as built would have looked really very different from how it looks now, possibly rather vulgar to modern eyes. That terracotta was reserved for the most important bits, such as Henry Marney's tomb. We've probably seen that image quite a few times in the course of today, so I won't say anything more about it, except to repeat that single important point, that it is in its overall form, it is still entirely Gothic, and yet it is covered with all this Renaissance detailing. So in one sense, it's sort of looking back. In another sense, though, it is very, very much up to date. And of course, the terracotta used on the tower itself in some of the architectural detailing. And I just want to digress a moment, because this whole use of terracotta is fascinating. I don't think anyone's really entirely worked out where it comes from. But if you look at that window on the right there, and then compare it as best you can with these three windows here, these are windows all in Suffolk, from left to right at Shrubland, Barham and Henley. And the Shrubland window is a domestic window. It's in the old hall at Shrubland. The other two are church windows. And these all seem to be made by the same team of itinerant craftsmen, probably Italian, working here at Lord Marney, and then working their way up through Suffolk and into Norfolk. And you can, as it were, deconstruct these buildings. You can see how the same moulds were used on each of these windows, but in slightly different combinations, different permutations. So now we come to the dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 onwards, a very much more significant date architecturally than the mere change of monarch in 1485. A completely different approach, apart from anything else, to building churches. Churches really cease to be built to any great extent because there was no longer any great benefit in building a church, because it no longer benefited your soul. Churches were built now, if at all, out of necessity or personal vanity rather than from religious motives, and there was a new breed of men with new money that they tended to put into their houses rather than into their churches. Waltham Abbey is a very good example of the sort of architectural consequences of the dissolution. Waltham Abbey, the actual building, was absolutely vast. It was on a scale of Canterbury Cathedral. It was a favourite abbey of Henry VIII. He used to go there quite a bit, and at the dissolution, it was one of the abbeys that was considered for turning into a cathedral, and how different things would have been if that had been the case. But I think it was too close to London, really. There wasn't a need for a cathedral between London and Norwich. So it was dissolved, the monastery was dissolved. It was actually the last monastery to be dissolved in 1540. And shows the full extent of Waltham Abbey at the time of the dissolution, and that rectangle there, that is the present church, which is, by standards of Essex, it is one of the biggest buildings in Essex. The original choir came up to this semicircular apse there, and then the church was extended at various times, the nave extended up to the crossing tower, and new choir up here. So, as you can see, it was an absolutely vast building, and just go back one to remind you of what is left. What is left, that is the rump of the original nave. Now, that small part of the abbey nave became the parish church, and gradually the rest of it was demolished. Bits were quarried essentially for other buildings, and the crossing tower fell down in 1553, probably because the other walls, the supporting walls, had all been taken away, and there was nothing to hold it up any longer. So the parish had to build a new tower, a new west tower, in 1556 to 8. So here is a rare example of building work at that time. The top has been rebuilt since, but you can see it is still very, very much a medieval church tower in form and function, and built entirely out of recycled materials from the rest of the abbey church. If you want to find a new church, a completely new church at this time, then really the only place to go is Woodham Walter, 1562 to 3, certainly the only new church in Essex built during Queen Elizabeth's reign. The reason for rebuilding it is a rather sort of 18th or 19th century one, I think, rather than a 16th century one. It was too close to Woodham Walter Hall for the Earl of Sussex, who owned it at that time. And so he demolished it and built a new one in the village. Ironically, Woodham Walter Hall no longer exists, and it's very hard to find any trace of it at all. We do still find the occasional additions to existing medieval churches at this time. Oh, sorry, that's just a little picture of Woodham Walter Hall Church, demonstrating the theory that it was the inspiration for one of the oldest churches in North America, St. Luke's Church in Virginia of 1632. I'm not sure the link has been established, but it's nice to think that might be the origin of it. There are still additions to existing medieval churches. This is Gosfield Church, with the North Chapel added in about 1560, and again the windows here, as they were at Lord Marney Church, the windows are of brick, rendered to look like stone, and there is really very little pretense to make them look like church windows. They're entirely, they've got little arches, the individual lights are slightly arched, but they've got that flat top, and really they look very domestic in character, even more so when you realise that this is Gosfield Hall itself, the west range of Gosfield Hall that was being built at just the same time, and really those windows are interchangeable between the church and the hall. Point to note here, we've got two views of the west range. On the left, that's the inside of the courtyard, and on the right is the outside. And you see how, although again it's not trying to look like a castle or anything like that, but it is still a very defensive sort of structure. There are no windows on the ground floor, whereas once you get inside into the courtyard, there are ground floor windows. So we've come back to domestic buildings, so we will continue with that, but take a step back a bit. This is Horham Hall, that was mentioned earlier as being unfinished in 1520. It had been being built since about 1502. And although, yeah, this is brick again, so it's very much of its period, but it is also, in its basic form, it is an extremely old-fashioned hall house, old-fashioned in the sense that the main body of the building, particularly behind that great big window there, that is a hall, a big open hall in the medieval tradition, open to the roof with even got a ventilator on the top there to let the smoke out. I mean, you know, no chimneys. That is old-fashioned. You've got the entrance to the house on the left, off-centre, no attempt at being symmetrical. So you come into the house, you turn right to go into the hall. If you're gentry, you turn left to go into the kitchen if you're not. And at the back of the hall, at the right-hand end of the hall, you have a passage and stairs which will lead up into sort of a private apartments where you've obviously got something, you've got a two-story block rather than the single-story block of the hall. I say that is, in spite of being in brick, it is still in many ways very old-fashioned. And this sort of old-fashionedness can be seen equally in domestic buildings lower down the scale, although not terribly far down the scale here. This is Paycock's in Coggeshall, of about the same date as Horham Hall, 1505 to 18, and the sort of parameters. And what is noticeable here is that you've got the very traditional timber-framed form of house with that slight overhang on the first floor, but the spaces between the timbers are filled not with plaster but with brick. So it's a new use of brick, if you like, laid in different but very definite patterns. Now, New Hall has been mentioned a few times, just outside Chelmsford. It's in the manor of Boreham. It actually came into the possession of Waltham Abbey in 1062 and became crown property in 1450. The Earl of Ormond was given a license to crenellate in 1491, so we can see, you know, something is being built at about that time. Then the property passed to Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne, who sold it to Henry VIII in 1516. And at that point, the early Tudor house was transformed into this great mansion called Bettley. Lovely name to reflect the countryside setting of this favourite place of King Henry's, now, alas, appropriated in recent years for the housing that encroaches upon the setting of what is now New Hall School. So this is a representation of the Beaulieu Palace complex as it was at its greatest extent. Ignore the range, the north range at the top, because that was built a little bit later. We'll come back to that later. But you have this great gatehouse entry of a form that we're sort of becoming familiar with, into this courtyard. On the left of the courtyard is the chapel. On the right of the courtyard is the great hall. Similarities with Horham that we've just been looking at, with that great big window there lighting the upper end of the hall and the ventilator on the roof, and behind it to one side this service courtyard. And I think if with that image, that rather nice display of royal arms that was on my sort of title screen, that is now inside New Hall, but it was originally that panel over the gatehouse there. Practically everything you see there has now gone, apart from the north range, which, as I say, we'll come back to, and that yard to the east. And inside the yard, there are some remnants of the Tudor house still visible. There's windows there which light the cellar. And another curious survival from New Hall that's not really fully, I don't think it's fully been understood, is this window which is now the east window of St Margaret's Church, Westminster, so you can go and see it there. It came to St Margaret's, Westminster from Copt Hall up near Epping in Essex, but it's unclear whether it was originally intended for the chapel at Bewley or whether it was originally made for Waltham Abbey and then came to Bewley after Henry acquired it. But it depicts these two little figures, bottom left and bottom right, Henry VIII on the left, Catherine of Aragon on the right. They were married between 1509 and 1533, and various indicators to point to a date of about 1515 to 1527. So it could have been made for Bewley, or it could have been moved here soon after Bewley was built, or enlarged for Henry. The Great Hall, incidentally, is one of these curious stories that is recorded by Essex historian Philip Morant. The Great Hall at Bewley is said to have been dismantled and moved to Witham, where it served as the assembly room for the spa that was established there in 1736. I heard someone chuckle. If anyone who knows Witham, that might seem rather surprising. Witham today, but there was a spa in Witham. It didn't really get off the ground, and if this did indeed happen, no trace has survived of the hall, nor any visual record that I'm aware of. And then we come inevitably and gloriously to Lord Marney, which, to be honest, I'm not going to say a lot about Lord Marney because, if you want, you look around you, really. But this is a model of how Lord Marney might have been, which I think is quite helpful, rather than just showing you another photograph of the gatehouse. Clearly what was built was mainly built before 1523, but we don't know how much had been built by any particular point. Going to be built round a quadrangle, a bit like Bewley, or indeed Hampton Court. And the conjecture here in the model is that the Great Hall would have been opposite the gatehouse. I don't know whether that's based on any sort of evidence or whether it's just thought to be. You see, I'm looking at Nick and he's sort of nodding, but anyway. I think what is clear is that this whole idea of having a gatehouse is obviously very much the thing, and putting apartments into it, this sort of stack up of really quite large and extravagant rooms in your gatehouse, intended probably as chambers of state for important visitors, such as the king, rather than as regular accommodation for the family and retainers. But here we are, we're still pre-Reformation, pre the dissolution, and that is when, again, things begin to change in quite a big way, because, to put it crudely, an awful lot of real estate comes onto the market. And a very good example of this is Lees Priory, acquired in 1536 by Sir Richard Rich, who, let's say it was not really a very nice man. But you didn't get to be Sir Richard Rich if you were too nice. These are the surviving buildings of the house that Sir Richard Rich created out of the remains of Lees Priory. A gateway on the right, which leads from the outer courtyard into the inner courtyard, and on the left is the sort of outer gateway and range of buildings, very much restored in the 19th century. So a little bit like Hampton Court, in that you progress from one courtyard to the next, with the big difference that in this case, presumably because that is rather based on what he found, instead of having the inner courtyard sort of straight ahead of you, you come in through the outer gate, and then you have to do a right turn to get to the inner gateway there and come into what was the cloister of the priory. And being a practical man, he's kept a lot of the existing priory buildings, but totally remodelled them, most noticeably down in this corner here. This is the site of the Priory Church, and the nave was turned by Rich into his great hall. Now, the house went through various owners until it was bought by Guy's Hospital in 1753. Presumably they wanted the farmland as an investment. They didn't want the liability of a big house, so they demolished most of it. But fortunately, there was a view of the inner outer courtyard, looking towards the inner courtyard in 1738. So there you can see the inner gateway looking very much as it does today, and I think that's rather an exciting view to the right of the gateway, with all those gables and all those chimneys and pinnacles, and then the lantern over the great hall, which was the nave of the Priory Church. So that's Richard Rich, created Baron Rich of Lees in 1547. There's his monument in Felsted Church, actually put up by I think it was his grandsons after 1619. So it's not a Tudor monument, but gosh, that's the gaze of a man that's focused, isn't it? But in Felsted, he founded the school in 1564 and also almshouses in 1565. So he was not all bad. As well as owning Lees Priory, he also owned Rochford Hall. We saw the church at Rochford earlier. This is the hall. We're just looking out of the churchyard there, so it's just opposite the church in Rochford. And if you want to sort of place Rochford, if you're not quite sure where Rochford is, if, as it were, you look to the left, that is basically the end of the runway of Southend Airport. So that's where Rochford is. And this, as I say, he bought it in 1550, and this is where he died in 1567. And this also has a Boleyn connection, because Thomas Boleyn was an earlier owner of Rochford Hall. But Rich completely rebuilt it, mainly of stone, which is unusual for our story, but reused stone, partly from the existing house and partly from Prittlewell Priory, just down the road, which Rich also conveniently owned. And all of that, you can see here, that what you can see there is largely been rendered, and it is thought that the whole thing was probably rendered. So we just skip over to that. I mean, there is a view in the inner courtyard, and you can see what a sort of complete mishmash of materials it is, with stone and brick and so on. So you would really want to have had that rendered to provide some sort of uniformity of appearance. That sort of semi-aerial view there, that shows what remains of the house, with that tower at the corner, and then dotted in is the outline of it at what is thought to have been its full extent, nearly 200 foot square, with at least 5 courtyards of one sort or another inside that space. But more than half of it, unfortunately, was destroyed by fire in 1760, and then it was further damaged by bombing in the Second World War. And now a lot of what you see is now a golf clubhouse, and the barns that you can see on the right there, they were put up after 1760, and a lot of that has now been turned quite nicely, actually, into houses in the 1980s. And then we come to Hill Hall at Thaden Mount, which, if you look out at the right place, you'll see it from the M25. Richard Rich died in 1567. This house started to be built in 1567 to 73, and really, I think you'll agree, it is a huge jump in stylistic terms. It's still a house built round a quadrangle, but it doesn't look, there's nothing remotely castle-like about that. There's no tower with battlements at the corner or anything like that. And there are a lot of classical elements, those columns, pediments, and so on. It was built by a man called Sir Thomas Smith, a man of great education and refinement, not a bruiser like Richard Rich. And amongst other things, he served as Queen Elizabeth's ambassador to France. He had a very extensive library, now at Queen's College, Cambridge, which included all the important architectural treatises, including the latest French ones. And here he is obviously putting into effect what he has learnt from his travels and in his architectural studies. It's a building that's been through many misfortunes. It was a women's prison for a time. Goodness knows who thought that was a good idea. Then it suffered a bad fire. It was restored by English Heritage, and that is an English Heritage photograph, and then divided up into apartments. The other great surprise of Hill Hall is the interior decoration, which survives in a few rooms with a sequence of really quite sophisticated wall paintings. Some of them are of biblical subjects, but others are based on classical mythology. And what you see here is a scene from the story of Cupid and Psyche. Now, I said we'd come back to New Hall, and here we are again. And 1573, or after 1573, there was remodelling by the Earl of Sussex, who remodeled that north range. And here it is, and that is, as I say, that is largely all that is left of that great building now. And the striking feature of this is that it's got all these windows. It's got these bay windows, huge, great windows, and showing you that this is not a defensive building. This is an outward-looking building. This is a domestic building. It's still got there's still a great hall in there, but from the outside you can't really immediately tell where it is. It doesn't affect the overall appearance of the outside, because if it did, that would upset the symmetry. And it's got these sort of classical details here round the main entrance with the arms of Queen Elizabeth over them. Here's a little bit smaller. Here's another house that still has a great hall, but again, not really apparent from the outside. This is Moynes Park of 1575 to 93. Like the north range of New Hall, it's got bay windows, big windows, and the overall effect is of symmetry with the entrance in the centre of the front. Just remind you, go back to Horham, you have the entrance on the left for functional reasons. Didn't care about symmetry, here they do. So the whole building, the whole facade is planned around being symmetrical. Coming down the social scale a bit, we find houses like Burden Hall, probably early 16th century, remodelled in the 1570s to 80s, and here we're really coming into something that is very much more recognisably a modern domestic plan, much more compact, basically square with a staircase in the middle. We looked at paycocks earlier as an example of how brick came to be used in traditional timber-framed houses, and here are a couple of other examples. The first from the middle of the 16th century. This is Parsonage House at Helians, Bumpstead. Very pretty on the outside, a typical sort of timber-framed cottage, if you like, with some brick nogging. If you remember, that's where you have the bricks between the timbers round at the back of the house. But the real surprise here is the brick fireplace inside it. Not surprising in itself to have a brick fireplace, but what's surprising is that it has this sophisticated terracotta frieze with Renaissance motifs. How that found its way into a house in Helians, Bumpstead is anybody's guess. little bit later probably is Roydon Hall at Ramsey, up towards Harwich, of about 1570. Again, very traditional, on first sight, a very traditional house, timber framed with jetted first floor. And again, we come back to this idea of the off-centre doorway, so no suggestion of symmetry there. But on the left-hand end, on the left gable, I think you can just make out the fact that there's a bit of brickwork there. And if you go around the corner, you see that the end wall is of brick, with the pedimented windows now filled in. So something very strange is happening here, in that you've got the use of brick, you've got these classical elements with the pediments, you've got the pinnacles, and there's no suggestion that this end gable wall was not built at the same time as the rest of the timber-framed house. You have these sort of classical, rather sophisticated elements popping up in unexpected places. Similarly, actually, just down the road at Wicks Abbey, of about the same date, where you've got the classical, rather classical-looking entrance there and a first-floor window with its classical pediment. And on the left there, there's the sort of rump of a projecting wing, and there was originally a similar projecting wing on the right. So as first built, that house would have been very much more symmetrical than it now appears. I mean, these places, Ramsey and Wicks, they seem a bit out of the way to us now, but in fact they're actually both near the main road to Harwich, so perhaps they shouldn't be considered as remote as they now do. I couldn't really talk about Tudor architecture in Essex without mentioning Bourne Mill, just on the edge of Colchester. It's very much a one-off, and so it doesn't really fit into the rest of the narrative, with this exception, that it was built from the materials of St John's Abbey in Colchester. So to that extent, it owes its existence to the dissolution of the monasteries. Built in 1591 by Thomas Lucas as a fishing lodge, and the way that it's been built, the way the materials have been used, with those pinnacles and the gable and so on, it does appear to be a deliberate attempt at being a picturesque building, which I think is quite unusual for that period. Built, as I say, as a fishing lodge, so something purely for pleasure, converted to a cloth mill in the 17th century, and then again to a corn mill in the 19th century. That is National Trust, so that is somewhere that you can visit. I should have mentioned similarly that Paycox in Coggeshall is also National Trust, as is the last building that I'm going to mention, which I couldn't really fail to mention, Audley End. Strictly speaking, it isn't Tudor, because it was begun in about 1605, but I think we've already established that these periods don't always fit very conveniently with changes of monarch, and its origins are thoroughly Tudor. Also, you will look at it and you'll say, well, it's not brick, so it doesn't really fit with my story either, but in fact it is built of brick but faced with stone, originally clunch, which is this stone that is basically chalk, not very hard wearing, and has therefore been replaced over the years, but brick, a sort of brick core, all of which adds to that feeling that one sometimes gets that brick was used when it was expedient to use brick, but not if something else was to hand or could be afforded. Anyway, Sir Thomas Audley, who died in 1544, he'd been granted Walden Abbey in 1538, and he converted part of the buildings into a residence. We don't know what that looked like. Perhaps it was similar to Lee's Priory, but it was Audley's grandson, the Earl of Suffolk, who was responsible for the house as seen here. This view was made in the 1670s of the work that had been going on since 1605. And it clearly followed closely the outline of the old house with the main court, there, that part there, laid out on the footprint of the abbey cloister. And in the course of repairs and so on in recent years, bits of the original abbey walling have been found within the walls of Audley End as it is today. Very traditional in having that outer courtyard, but unlike Hampton Court or Lees Priory, you didn't then progress through an inner gateway, but came straight to the Great Hall, as perhaps was going to be the case here. Very symmetrical, the Great Hall, with the traditional big window, still got that traditional big window of the Great Hall, but right in the middle of that range. You still got a porch, you still got an entrance on the left, taking you into the screen's passage of the Great Hall, but here you've got a balancing porch on the right, so that you have that symmetrical facade. And the porches themselves absolutely bang up to date in terms of their classical detailing. Now, there have, of course, been many alterations since, principally the demolition of the outer court and of the east range at the top of that east range there. So basically what you're left with is just that, those three sides there, but carefully preserving the overall symmetry. And this was a part of a process we find in other courtyard houses, including Ingatstone Hall, of opening them out to the surrounding countryside and into their parkland setting, but that's something that really belongs to the 18th century and is therefore for another day. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much. A nice way to finish a really interesting day. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to?
I think we'd all like a drink, really, wouldn't we?
Right.
Jim, the stable block here at Lord Marney is terribly close to the building and perhaps shields some of the front of it.
I know, it is a bit of a mystery. I don't know if there's an explanation for it, but not only is it very close to the house, but it's also at a slight angle, isn't it, and the barn and everything. And it does, if we assume that the sort of formal approach to the house was coming up to the gateway, you would never have got a very good symmetrical view of it, would you? Because you've got the stables now, the gallery on the right, and you've got the church on the left. I mean, all lovely buildings in themselves, but they do rather detract from the overall sort of grand effect of arriving at this great symmetrical gatehouse. So I don't know, does it depend just on what was there already and making the best of? I'm sort of looking rather desperately at the Charringtons here who've lived with this problem for many, many years, and I don't think anyone's come up with a very satisfactory answer, to be honest.
Horses were terribly prestigious, so to have 30-odd horses in your stable, there might be a sort of bragging element about it, but that doesn't fully answer it.
No, because I still think you'd want to have them, you'd want to have something that was symmetrical and aligned. I mean, if you think of Audley End, it's actually got over here, you can't see it in this photograph, but over here you've got this wonderful, what are they, Jacobean stables, really prominent as you come up to the house. You see this marvellous building that looks like anyone else would think, well, that's a lovely country house, but it's actually the stables. So there they were making a virtue and a display of their horses, but without detracting from the splendour of the house.
Another question?
Perhaps Julie's going to answer.
I'm not going to answer it.
Oh.
I was thinking, thank you, with all these brick buildings all over the county, were there a huge number of brick kilns everywhere, or were there central kilns from which the bricks were brought?
No, well, there's a whole book on that. You won't be surprised. But no, I think you will find that the brick, transporting anything was jolly expensive and difficult unless you were doing it by water. And I think you found one of the great things about brick was that you dug a hole somewhere and got the earth out, and you did it all on site as much as possible. There's probably somewhere called Brickfield around here, isn't there?
I think we'll make this the last. Oh, okay, we'll do 2 questions.
You mentioned on a couple of occasions buildings or the builders, licensed trembling.
Yeah.
What was the thinking behind a particular regulation of commemoration?
Well, it was the authority permission that you were given by the king to build a castle, basically. So in the days when you were building serious castles, then that was quite an important thing to have. It sort of carried on into the Tudor period. I don't know when it stopped exactly, but I guess sometime in the 16th century. So it petered out rather. But it was permission to build a defensible building. Yes, yeah. And it just came, and so, but by the time you're getting into the 16th century, then you might still have permission, you might still seek permission, but it's not really going to be a defensible building. So I suppose if you're building a defensible building, then potentially you are a threat, aren't you, to the sovereignty of the king, and therefore you need permission. But the great thing is they are all recorded. They're all listed, which gives a good date for some of these buildings.
Okay, last question.
Promise it's very quick. There's something been worrying me for many, many years. What I call the dark headers, which are sometimes glazed and set in diamonds here.
Yeah.
Were they just selected from random bricks from a general firing, or did they make a special high temperature firing to make them separately?
And I'm not 100% sure. I think they would have had a separate firing, and depending on what you used, what fuel you used, and perhaps mixing certain things in with the basic clay, you could get different colours as a result.
But we found if you have firing, you make lots of nice red bricks, but there's always these dark ones.
Yes.
Which come through, and I was just wondering whether that was random, they just selected those and put them on one side and then used them in construction, or, as I say, was it a separate high temperature?
I think that they would have been, by this point where you're wanting to use them so decoratively, I don't think you would be able to rely on sort of getting enough by accident, as it were. I think they would be deliberately.
All the bricks up near Sudbury make bricks for us for repairs and so forth, and they actually make them as part of the general firing, but they know which bricks they're going to use for the headers. And when you see sort of Tony Minter, it's rather like watching one of the witches from Macbeth as he sort of dips it into Carrageen moss, and I don't know what else, but they put those bricks right close to the fire, so that they will always burn harder and darker. But on top of that, they put the glaze on, so that you get an even more pronounced effect. But I think it comes from sort of that knowledge of the kiln, I think. I don't know whether that's what they do today.
I don't think the glaze was originally intended. I mean, that's maybe what they do now to get a good glaze. I think originally it just sort of happened. And I mean, I was looking at lunchtime, the wall at the back of your beautiful toilets. Your award-winning toilets.
2010.
Yeah. I mean, those are particularly good examples of quite shiny dark headers of a very interesting range of colours.
And those are all
Bulmer.
Yeah.
Actually, in the firing process, if you want to raise temperature,
Yeah.
firing process. And that brings up a very, very much higher temperature. And I've seen it used in France, in our on pottery particularly. They used to glaze pottery by bringing up a higher temperature using salt dropped into the kiln at a critical point in the process. So again, you could generate that high temperature. And you've got salt pot just down the road here.
Yeah.
Where does your salt come from? Transportation costs are much lower. Clay was probably from here as it and so you've got an opportunity to make that southern firing much, much hotter than it was.
Good. Well, Marv, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you.